Hey listeners, this is the English adaptation of Humo, Murder and Silence in El Salvador. Para español, vuelva al feed y selecciona el título en español. Join the conversation on social media by tagging @ThisIsSonoro. The episode you're about to listen to contains descriptions of physical violence and stories of victims of disappearance. Listener discretion is advised. In February 2020, I was in El Salvador for a personal reporting trip. I was there to see if I could figure out what had happened to my uncle, Raul. He'd been killed at the beginning of the Civil War. He was active in the country's insurgency, fighting against the government at the time. And soon after he was killed, my mother was forced to flee. For years, we'd been wanting to look into it. It seemed like this was finally the right moment. I met and interviewed people who knew him. Friends, classmates, survivors of the Civil War, still carrying the pain and trauma of that time. It was a revelation that my family's case is not unique. The legacy of the Civil War lives on. People still don't have answers and are afraid to ask even basic questions about what happened to their loved ones. It was emotional and intense. Still, I was making headway. I'd even managed to connect with Israel Ticas, the country's top criminologist, to see if we could figure out where my uncle was buried. But then, I had to hit pause to cover a breaking news story. On February 9th, El Salvador's lawmakers were sitting in the Blue Room of the Assembly. Surrounding them are soldiers bearing rifles. Nobody understands what's going on. Minutes before, President Nayib Bukele had given a speech outside for a frenzied crowd of supporters. He demanded the lawmakers approve $109 million in funding for his security plan, the Plan Control Territorial. Upon finishing his speech, he entered the building, flanked by dozens of soldiers. These weren't your typical Secret Service type security forces. None of this was standard procedure. President Bukele was making a show of force. While I was doing interviews steeped in memories from survivors of the Civil War, here was President Bukele, evoking militarism not seen since that dark time in the country's history. Lawmakers shared their thoughts on social media and with journalists.
¿Acaso con el fusil en la cabeza nos van a obligar a votar?
Bajo amenaza, bajo las armas, definitivamente esta asamblea no va a actuar.
They weren't going to give in to this game, this stunt, this threat. After making his entrance, President Bukele walked up and sat in the chair that typically belongs to the Assembly president, who didn't come to the session. President Bukele rang the gong to open the session. Per the Constitution, only the Assembly President can start the session. But President Bukele did it instead.
Ahora, creo que está muy claro quién tiene el control de la situación y la decisión que vamos a tomar ahora la vamos a poner en manos de Dios.
It's clear who's in control now. President Bukele set the microphone aside. He put his hands together, pressed them against his forehead, and bowed, praying silently, putting the decision, the fate of his security plan, the cornerstone of his presidency, in God's hands. When he finished praying, President Bukele abruptly stood up. Nobody, not Bukele, nor any of his allied lawmakers, introduced the proposal. So not a single member of the Assembly voted for or against increasing the budget for the security plan. Minutes after he had entered, without saying a word, Bukele walked off the stage and right out of the Assembly building. Outside, President Bukele greeted his supporters once more, and he said that he had just talked to God.
Yo le pregunté a Dios, y Dios me dijo, paciencia.
And God told him, patience. Then, a warning.
Paciencia. El 28 de febrero, todos esos sinvergüenzas van a salir por la puerta de afuera y los vamos a sacar democráticamente.
The president was referring to the legislative elections that would take place within a year. He asked his followers for one thing: go to the polls and vote for his party. Nuevas ideas, new ideas. To vote out the scoundrels who refused to vote for his security plan. And his followers listened. In February 2021, Nuevas Ideas won a majority in the assembly. Now, Nayib Bukele had Congress under his control. The new lawmakers would approve funding for his security plan. But he wouldn't stop there. Soon, the president would have even more power than he asked for on that fateful February day. My name is Daniel Alvarenga. I'm a Salvadoran American journalist. Join me and hear how the discovery of a mass grave in El Salvador uncovered a crisis of violence and corruption, reaching up to the highest levels of government. It's a crisis that I followed from afar, but that ended up touching close to home. For Sonoro Media, in collaboration with Revista Factum, this is Humo, Murder and Silence in El Salvador. Episode 5, The Storm. A year after President Bukele stormed into the assembly, lawmakers reconvened for the first session of the new assembly. Reporter Brian Avelar was on the scene.
Cuando llegué a la sesión, pareció un show, un desfile de modas, ahí todos tomándose selfies.
Assembly Vice President Suesi Callejas approached the mic and proposed something that nobody expected. She proposed dismissing Supreme Court judges and that new judges would be selected by her party, Nuevas Ideas, giving President Bukele control of all three branches of government. Brian was dumbfounded. He began sending frantic text messages to the Factum newsroom.
O sea, no podía creerlo, lo que había escuchado. Le pregunté a otros colegas qué es lo que estaba pasando. Sentí miedo, debo decirlo.
El Salvador Supreme Court has 15 judges and an equal number of substitutes. Nuevas Ideas was proposing to remove 5 of the 15 judges and their substitutes. This was not only unprecedented, it violated the process for removing and appointing judges laid out in the country's constitution. Yet, the assembly, without hesitation, voted in favor of it. Reporter Carla Arevalo was following the broadcast from home, but as soon as she saw this,
creo que hasta se me cortó la voz y lo primero que hice fue irme para la asamblea.
She grabbed her phone and camera and rushed to the building. She ran into Brian along the way. Longtime reporters Brian and Carla have seen a lot go down, but they never imagined the assembly would replace a third of the Supreme Court, let alone on their first day on the job. As they were starting to process the news and inform their editors, some of their sources began contacting them. Vans with tinted windows had pulled up in front of the Supreme Court, just a few feet away from where they were standing. They needed to be there and see what on earth was going on. Everything seemed to be happening at the same time. Carla and Brian rushed over to the building. Outside, it was starting to rain. They watched in disbelief, incredulous that it had come to this. Armed guards at the Supreme Court.
No podía creer lo que estaba pasando y a partir de ahí podía esperar cualquier cosa. Entonces nada, llegué allí frente al Palacio de la Corte Suprema de Justicia y había policías armados ahí.
They stood in the rain a while longer, doing their best to continue sending updates to their editors. The rain picked up. Now, it was a full-blown storm. And the night wasn't over yet. The two reporters returned to the assembly, where another unprecedented vote was taking place. This time, lawmakers voted to replace the Attorney General. Carla got in her car and rushed to the Attorney General's office. She saw police forces pull up, as if a special operation was underway. They demanded entry.
Y le dicen, abra el portón, es una orden.
Within minutes, a black van came in, carrying the newly appointed Attorney General. Carla stood in shock, watching the scene unfold. Now, there was nothing to stand in the way of President Bukele and his agenda. The executive, legislative, and judicial branch all were under his influence. He'd moved quickly to consolidate his power. A soft coup. Back in DC, I had to report that, for the first time since the military dictatorship in 1979, one man held all the political power in El Salvador. But he had almost the entire country behind him. Bukele's approval rating was among the highest in the world. Surveys showed 86% of Salvadorans had faith in him. President Bukele seemed poised to deliver on his agenda, the cornerstone of which was ending the brutal, bloody gang violence that had plagued the country for years. But even with the entire government in his hands, it wasn't enough. The violent reality of the country would soon come crashing in. President Bukele's seemingly unshakable image began to crumble just a few months after the assembly. It was because on May 7th, 2021, police found one of the largest hidden graves in the country, in Chalchuapa. All thanks to Jacqueline Lima, the young woman whose cries alerted the authorities to what was happening in Hugo Sorio's house. She failed to save her own life, but finally uncovered the house of horrors in Estevez Alley. The media held Jacqueline as the heroine of Chalchuapa. Her family was thrust into the spotlight too. Her grandfather, Don Jose, became the voice of families affected. Don Jose is 77 years old. He has thick gray hair with shocks of white throughout, and a mustache and eyebrows to match. He's soft-spoken, mild-mannered. Jacqueline and Alexis were his beloved grandchildren. Both were found in Chalchuapa. Don Jose was by far the most visible victim in the case. And still, it took the government 52 days to hand over Alexis's body. By then, it was already in an advanced stage of decomposition.
Fue una ingratitud la que hicieron. Todo engusanado, ¿no? Como un animalito, ¿verdad? Y mi hijo no era un animal.
To receive his body in this state was shocking. Alexis was a human being, not an animal. Don Jose's pain was published in report after report, recounted in dozens of newscasts. Each time, he recalled the mistreatment he received at the hands of the government. He was so present in the media that finally, the government decided to pay attention to him. The resources rolled in: food, support for funeral expenses, trucks full of construction materials. The Ministry of Housing even sent a team of workers to reinforce and paint the worn-out walls of his old house. When the house was finished, the housing minister herself stopped by in person for an inauguration. With press and cameras, of course. With gallons and gallons of white paint on the walls of Don Jose's house, it appeared the government was trying to cover up the crisis. It seemed like media coverage was the key for families to get answers, to get the government to care. That proved true for Ivette Toledo, too. Her two children, Karen and Eduardo Guerrero Toledo, had disappeared in September 2021, 4 months after the discovery of the mass grave in Chalchuapa. She'd been searching for them with little to no help from the police. Reporter Brian Avelar learned about her case and reached out. They met at her house. Ivette greeted Brian warmly, offering him coffee. They sat down and started talking. The day she disappeared, her daughter Karen went to a picnic. Ivette had asked her son to go and pick Karen up.
Cuando ya eran las 7 de la noche, yo ya sabía que algo había pasado. O sea, mi corazón me lo avisaba, algo pasó.
But they never returned home. By evening, Ivette knew. Something had happened. After several hours telling Brian the painful details of the day her children disappeared, Ivette paused. She asked Brian if he'd had any lunch. When he said no, she wordlessly got up and went into the kitchen. She came back with a plate of food. Eggs, beans, and bread for them to share. Even in her darkest, most painful hour, she was looking after Brian. While they ate, she continued with her story. She and Eduardo were inseparable. He always helped her around the house. And he just graduated with a full scholarship. Karen, likewise, was a good kid. Outgoing, sweet. She loved animals. With tenderness and conviction, Ivette told Brian about her children. And it's how she continued her search for 2 months, with no help from the police. On November 8, 2021, 2 months after Ivette's children had disappeared, the government held a press conference. They had arrested suspects in the case. Gustavo Villatoro, the Minister of Justice and Security, gave a statement.
Es una relación de drogas la que está de por medio en este caso, y aquí quiero hacer un vehemente llamado.
Minister Villatoro said the disappearance was linked to drugs. He encouraged parents to keep an eye on their kids. In a way, accusing Ivette of not taking better care of Karen and Eduardo.
Para este caso, lamentablemente, recibimos la denuncia casi 48 horas después de que los hermanos habían desaparecido.
He blamed Ivette's family for waiting 48 hours to report their disappearances. Then, Minister Villatoro went a step further. He singled out Karen and Eduardo as having links with MS-13 members.
Hay una relación directa, jóvenes, droga, pandilla.
This was not the first time a government official had leveled these accusations at a victim or the family of a missing person. It's unfortunately a very common occurrence in El Salvador. What's not common is what Ivette did next. The day after the official press conference, she organized her own event.
Mis hijos están desaparecidos. Por el simple hecho de ser jóvenes, ahora son culpables de que los hayan desaparecido.
The government chose to blame her children instead of helping her. In a way, re-victimizing her all over again. Ivette had tears in her eyes as camera flashes lit up her face, but she continued.
Mi hija Karen Ivette, mi hijo Henry Eduardo Guerrero Toledo no tenían vínculos con pandillas.
She denied what Minister Villatoro had said the day before. Her children didn't have any sort of gang ties. And she recounted in intense detail the failures of authorities in the search for Karen and Eduardo. Ivette's family had tried to file a report on that Sunday, September 18th, the day her children disappeared. But the police said they had to wait 72 hours.
No voy a descansar hasta saber dónde están mis hijos.
At the end of the conference, Ivette addressed Minister Villatoro directly with one question.
Yo le digo, por favor, ¿dónde está Karen y Eduardo Guerrero? ¿Dónde están mis hijos?
Where are my children? As Ivette recounted all of this to Brian, he was impressed by her bravery.
Ivette estaba haciendo historia. La madre de 2 desaparecidos le hacía cara públicamente al Estado por primera vez.
Here she was, a humble person, a housewife, publicly confronting the state. It was historic. Ivette knew it was bold. She returned home hoping that now people would listen to her, believe her. But they didn't. Neighbors and friends started avoiding her, cutting her off entirely. She knew they thought the government was lying about her kids, but they were scared. Scared of what could happen if they associated with her. She was more alone than ever. The words of Minister Beatoro did irreparable harm.
Desgraciadamente mi vida me la arruinaron. Me la arruinaron el día que me los quitaron a ellos y me la terminaron de arruinar con ese discurso. Siento que fui como una víctima más.
She told Brian that Minister Beatoro's speech ruined her life. It made her feel like a victim once more. Even her family decided it was best to distance themselves from her. In El Salvador, the government can create a witch hunt, silencing people like Ivette who are brave enough to speak up. In this environment, often, the truth doesn't matter. Hours after Ivette's press conference, the government came looking for her. As with Don Jose, they attended to her case only when it became high profile. A car picked Ivette up and drove her to a tent set up in a park nearby. High-ranking Bukele officials gathered, waiting for her. Among them, President Bukele's newly appointed Attorney General. Ivette was directed to sit in a little chair, facing these high-ranking government officials.
Mantuve mi postura, jamás me les achiqué.
It was intimidating, but she kept her composure. Even as she teared up describing her kids, she never lost sight of her goal: to defend them. Once more, she was adamant. Karen and Eduardo didn't belong to a gang. One by one, these high-ranking government officials apologized to Ivette. At one point during the meeting, Ivette felt a hand on her shoulder. It was President Nayib Bukele. She could see he was calculating, precise with his words. Still, he said he was committed to helping her find Karen and Eduardo. The government had condemned Ivette and her children publicly. Now, facing backlash from her press conference, they comforted her, privately. A week later, authorities discovered a body buried on a farm in Nuevo Cuscatlan. It's a town about a half-hour away from the capital, San Salvador. It also happens to be the city where Nayib Bukele started his political career as mayor. Ivette was hopeful. She thought it could be Karen, but it wasn't. The body turned out to be that of Jimena Ramirez, a young footballer who disappeared almost a month earlier. Still, Ivette regained hope when they found more bodies buried at the farm. It turned out authorities had uncovered a hidden grave that belonged to MS-13. At first glance, it was even larger than the hidden grave in Chalchuapa. The discovery of a second grave was another major blow to President Bukele's image. He'd been touting the success of his security plan, the cornerstone of his presidency. He'd pour so much energy into projecting an image of security and safety, yet here was another mass grave. It was a little after 8 p.m. on Christmas Eve. I was in California with my family. We'd just taken the turkey out of the oven to make our traditional pan con chumpe. And like most Salvadorans, we have a tradition of spending Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve on the phone, talking and texting with our family in El Salvador. This year was no exception. It's a sweet tradition, one that makes me feel connected to my family and my country. In San Salvador, meanwhile, Brian was also celebrating the holiday. He was at a friend's house. They had also made a turkey. The group swapped verses of La Llorona in between jokes and laughter. Weeks had passed, and Brian hadn't heard anything new about the mass grave in Nuevo Cuscatlan. Mainly, Brian was grateful to have made it through another year, to be spending time with friends and family. They were just sitting down to eat when he got a text. It was Ivette.
Pues no sabía qué hacer y le dije, Brian, ahora sí necesito ayuda. No sé qué hacer.
She needed help. The day before, Minister Villatoro had called her. They'd found bodies and believed they were her kids. Ivette went to identify them. When she arrived at the farm where they'd found the bodies, investigators put 2 of the white bags in front of her. There were other bags nearby. She approached one of them. It was her daughter, Karen. Investigators asked her if she wanted to see the other body. Without hesitation, she said yes. It was Eduardo. She told the investigators she recognized his teeth. Still, they said she had to wait for a DNA test, to be sure. So on December 24th, she received confirmation. The DNA test results. On Christmas Eve, this mother mourned the loss of her children, yet again. All she wanted was to give them a proper burial.
Pero ese 24, yo no tenía dinero para nada. Y pues tampoco tengo familia porque con eso que hizo el gobierno conmigo es como que me alejó a todo el mundo.
She didn't have money or anyone to turn to. So, recalling Brian's words, that she could reach out whenever, she did. And Brian responded immediately. He took to Twitter, asking anyone who wanted to lend a hand to give a few dollars to help Ivette bury her children. Dozens of people started to deposit money into Yvette's bank account. Hours after Brian's tweet, officials from the president's office contacted her. They would pay for everything. Two and a half years into his presidency, President Bukele boasted daily about the falling homicide rates. From 9 murders per day when he came to power, now there were just 3. But an unknown number of deaths weren't being counted, accumulating secretly, underground, in hidden graves. In the last few months of 2021, for the first time in El Salvador's history, official figures for disappearances exceeded those for killings. Added to the list, the mass graves discovered in Chalchuapa and Nuevo Cuscatlan. Thousands of mothers across the country face the same reality as Ivette. With all the media attention Ivette received, other mothers began reaching out to her. Even as she felt shaky, uncertain, she became a symbol of strength for many. Yvette's press conference seemed to awaken something new. Mothers and relatives from all over the country joined together and created a search block for missing persons in El Salvador. With Chalchuapa, Don José's voice demanded dignified treatment for the victims.
Fue una ingratitud la que hicieron.
With Nuevo Cuscatlan, Ivette was demanding the authorities find answers, find her children.
¿Dónde está Karen y Eduardo Guerrero? ¿Dónde están mis hijos?
And now, all those voices together, they were ready to make more noise than ever.
Estoy aquí con todos mis hermanos porque es una familia que estamos aquí juntas, luchando por nuestros hijos, nuestros esposos, familiares, todos.
Brian joined the search block for a few days. He saw firsthand just how far these parents will go, putting their own lives at risk, venturing into the most dangerous, dark back alleys of the country, all to find their missing children.
Humo, Murder and Silence in El Salvador is a Sonoro original series, in collaboration with Revista Factum. This episode was produced by Fernanda Estrada and Hannah Bottom, with the help of Sara Mota. Written by Fernanda Estrada and Brian Avelar. Adaptation by Hannah Bottom. Hosted by Daniel Alvarenga. Edited by Rodrigo Crespo and Nick Milanes. The managing editor was Rodrigo Crespo. Reporting by Brian Avelar, Fernando Romero, Gerson Nájera and Angelina Mosher Salazar. Factum's team coordination and editorial consulting by Horus Villacorta. Fact-checking by Evelyn Uribe. Tape sync by Gerson Nájera. Mix and sound design by Fernando Galaviz. Original music by Laura Cruz and Héctor Fernández. Executive producers Jasmine Romero, Camila Victoriano, Jerónimo Ávila and Joshua Weinstein. Thanks to Canal 12, Red Salvadoreña de Medios, and El Diario de Hoy for archival tape.